Hey everybody, it's Matt. Welcome back to the Journey Church podcast. If you haven't yet, be sure to subscribe to this podcast so you can automatically get our weekly episodes. And you might want to go ahead and subscribe to our Journey YouTube channel as well. You'll find messages, music, interviews, inspiring stories, and more for you all right there. Now, I hope this episode helps you take your next step in following Jesus. Today, I want to start with a bit of a quiz. But this is a pretty easy quiz. You don't need to answer these questions out loud, but you're going to know the answer to them. If you don't know the answer to them, well, it may reveal a bigger problem that we can't solve this morning, all right? So here are the two questions. The first one was this. If I had a glass of water and I asked you to tell me how much water was in the glass, how would you do it? Well, the way you would do it is you would take the water and you would measure it against a standard. And you know we all have a standard for fluids, right? For liquids, it's ounces or gallons, whatever it may be. We have a standard. So you'd use a measuring cup or you'd use something else like that and you'd figure out how much water was in the glass. It'd be pretty simple. If I had a piece of wood up here and I said, hey, I want you to tell me how long this piece of wood is, again, be super simple because we have a standard. It's inches and it's feet. I was hanging out with my buddy the other day. It's totally off subject. I was hanging out with my buddy the other day who's from South Africa. He's just moved over here. And he was like, can you explain this inches and feet thing to me? Because it's all metric with them, right? And he was like, metric makes perfect sense. How many feet are in a mile? And I said, 5,280. And he said, exactly. Where'd that number come from? And I was like, listen, buddy, when you save the world twice in wars, you can come up with whatever you want. He didn't buy into that either. But anyway, we have a standard. It may be a flawed standard, but we have a standard over here, right? The rest of the world has their own, but we have feet and inches and all that. So if I said, how big is this piece of wood? You'd just get a tape measure, wouldn't you? You'd say, oh, it's this many feet, this many inches. There's a standard. So we all understand this. But if I were to ask you, how do you know how mature a Jesus follower is? How do you know how spiritually mature you are? How would you answer that? Well, you would have to compare yourself or compare that Jesus follower to a standard. The question is, what's the standard for that? That's what we're going to talk about today. This is week 2 of our short 2-week series called What America Needs Now, because I'm trying to keep my job, so 2 weeks is all I'd risk it, okay? If you were here last week, thanks for coming back. I appreciate it, because we're diving into a bit of the political world, but not in the sense of we're going to tell you how to vote. We don't do that kind of thing. But in the sense of there is so much tension right now, and the idea of politics, the topic of politics is dominating all of our conversations. And the question many of us have or should have is, well, how do I navigate and work my way through all of this tension without burning any bridges? How do I do it where I don't upset people or I don't create division? How do I navigate through this without hurting someone? And so last week I started with the simple question of, okay, if you were to fill in the blank, what America needs most now is, what would you put in the blank? And the reality is, because of the discourse in our nation right now, most of us immediately think something political. We think, well, I think America most needs 4 more years of Trump or 4 years of Harris or, 4 years of a third option if we could have one, wherever you land in all of that. But my suggestion, at least for Jesus followers, and if you're not, you can do whatever you want, okay? But my suggestion for Jesus followers is that there is a better answer to put in the blank. That what should go in the blank is not something political. It's something far more personal. That what those of us who are Jesus followers should be thinking about is this. What America needs most now is a group of Jesus followers in our country who choose to pursue the kind of maturity that Jesus called us to pursue, which is a we before me, you first kind of maturity. Not an all about me, personalized, customized form of Christianity. They're very different. But this is what most of us are pursuing. We're pursuing a version of Christianity where we create our own standard that allows us to feel good about where we are in terms of our spiritual maturity. And then it gives us the freedom to actually act and do and say whatever we want to act and do and say and not feel bad about it. So we pick and choose the things that Jesus taught, and we throw out these things because they don't really fit with what we want to do, and we hold on to these things because they align with what we believe in. But all we've done is create a customized, personalized version. We've created a standard that's not actually a standard. We've created what's actually consumer Christianity. And consumer Christianity is when a group of Christians decide, oh, I'm just going to create something that makes me feel good. So I'm just going to show up at church if I get something out of it. And there are certain songs that make me feel good, so I really hope they sing more of those and less of the others. And there are certain topics that make me feel good. I wish he'd talk about more of those and less of the others. And I'm going to read my Bible and pray as long as it makes me feel good and I feel close to God. But the minute the feeling goes away, well, I'm kind of out on that then. Because I just want to make sure everything's good between me and God, and I want to feel good inside. As long as I feel good about me, then it's working for me. But that is not what Jesus introduced into the world. That's a faulty standard for those of us who are Jesus followers. He invited us to pursue a we before me, you first kind of maturity that had a very different standard. So the way we defined maturity last week, if you weren't with us, is simply this. Maturity is increasingly believing and behaving more like Jesus. The question is, how do you know if this is true for you? Another way to say it would be, how do you know if you actually have a growing, mature, deepening relationship with Jesus? Well, you have to have a standard to measure yourself against. And the Apostle Paul, in a letter that he wrote to Christians in the region of Galatia, actually explains to us, describes for us what this standard is. Now, before we get into it, the whole reason he wrote this letter to these Christians in this region is because they were doing the very thing so many of us Christians in America are doing today. They had gotten fooled into picking and choosing what they wanted to believe and customizing and personalizing their own form of Christianity. And they had decided there are certain behaviors that are really important to us, and so if you don't do those, you're going to be in trouble with us, and there are other things we're going to completely ignore that Jesus taught because we don't really want to have to follow that. But they had created a faulty standard that was excluding people, that was causing people to walk away from the very idea of following Jesus to begin with. And so if you've never done it, you should read the letter that Paul wrote to the Galatians. You can read it in about 15 minutes. But you will see that Paul is very clear with them that what they're doing is unhealthy. And then, near the end of the letter, he begins to describe what the standard is to determine whether those of us who are Jesus followers are mature or not, whether we're growing in our relationship with Jesus or not, whether we're deep or not. I just want to be deep. Okay, well, Paul's about to tell us what deep looks like. And so I want to drop in near the end of his letter and show you what he says. He begins this way. He says, "So I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh." Now, when he talks about walking by the Spirit, and I'll explain this more in a minute, but he's referring to a promise that he had told the Galatians Jesus made. So just before Jesus' arrest and crucifixion, all of that, he was sitting down with his followers and telling them, I'm about to disappear. Like I'm going to leave this earth in not too long. And it freaked them out. They panicked. And so Jesus said, no, it's not a bad thing that I leave and I'm not with you anymore. Because I'm going to give you a gift. I'm going to give you my Spirit. The Spirit of God is going to live inside of you if you follow me. And the Spirit of God's always going to be with you. And the Spirit of God is going to guide you and teach you and help you to know exactly what you should do and help you become the person that you most want to be, help you become the person God created you to be. So Paul knew Jesus had made this promise. That's what he's referring to when he says, I want you to walk by the Spirit that God's given you. And again, we'll talk about what that means in a second. But he says, when you do that, you're not going to gratify the desires of the flesh. Now, he didn't really have to explain this part to us, did he? We all know what the desires of the flesh are. The desires of the flesh are the things that we all naturally want to do. And quite often we do, even though they're the exact opposite of who we want to be. You know what I'm talking about? Like we've always said, I want to be this kind of person. But then we have this desire to do something that's in direct contradiction of that. And we're like, oh yeah, but I want to do it, so I'm going to do it, you know? So we do things that derail or undermine or conflict with the people we want to be, much less the people God created us to be. Those are natural desires. And they're so hard to say no to because they just feel so natural and they just pull so hard for us to do them. So this is what Paul's talking about. And he actually decides to give them a little bit of a list of some of the natural desires they were engaged in that Paul would say is just so immature. I mean, that behavior is so immature. That behavior is so childish. You shouldn't engage in that. He goes on to write, The acts of the flesh, they're obvious. In other words, I shouldn't even have to give you a list. You can make your own list. But then he gives us a list, okay? Here are some of these immature behaviors. He said things like sexual immorality, impurity, debauchery. Now, we don't use that term a lot, and I was thinking, how do I explain debauchery to you guys? Here's the best way I know to describe it. Just go to Broadway in Nashville about 2 a.m., okay? You'll know it when you see it, but I guarantee you'll see it at some point. Now, somebody asked me after first service, how do you know that, Matt? I've been told, okay? I've been told. So anyway, debauchery, idolatry. Now, we're like, here's what idolatry is. It's whenever you put a person or a thing or a passion, you make it a higher priority than Jesus. That's idolatry. All right, okay? We're guilty of that one too. We've done that. Witchcraft. You'd think we could get a pass on this one, but first century witchcraft, the whole point of it was simply to try to manipulate God to get him to do what you wanted him to do. We've all been guilty of that at some point, haven't we? He goes on. Hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, factions, envy, drunkenness, orgies. Go to Broadway, 2 a.m. You might see that one too. I'm not even going to describe that one. And the like. This is Paul's way of saying, okay, you just add to the list. Just fill in the blank. You know, we can make a list a mile long. Because it's obvious to us. We know all the natural desires inside of us. Things that we want to do, even though they go against the kind of people we often want to be. We know all the things that we do, and then we look in the mirror and go, why did I do that? I wish I hadn't have done that. Now I regret that. But at the time I didn't regret it. It just felt good then, so I did it. This is what Paul's talking about. He's going, okay, those things just come naturally. And if you want to break the cycle of those behaviors in your life, if you want to move out of that immature behavior, well, you can't do it on your own. Paul's point is you're going to need some help. So he writes next this. He says, but the fruit of the Spirit is. And now he's referring back to this idea of walking with the Spirit. His point is, okay, if you're a follower of Jesus, God's put his Spirit inside of you, and the Spirit's tapping on your conscience. The Spirit's nudging your heart whenever you're about to go do one of those things that comes natural to you, but it's actually not in your long-term best interest. It's not good for you. He says the Spirit's tapping on your heart. And if you choose to surrender to or walk with the Spirit, if you just pay attention to what's going on inside of you, the Spirit is going to produce something different in you. The Spirit is going to produce something supernatural that you can't do on your own. You can't produce this list Paul's about to give us. You can't produce this on your own. But if you cooperate with God's Spirit in you, he will produce it in and through you. And he gives us a list now that is the standard. You want to measure maturity. You want to know how mature, spiritually mature you are. You want to know, how you're doing it, growing in your relationship with Jesus. Here's the standard, this list. He says the fruit of the Spirit is love. Not any kind of love. Not the, I love them and they love me, so they're easy to love. He's not talking about that kind of love. He's talking about the we before me, you first, love your enemy kind of love. He's talking about when you look at someone who is clearly against you or out to get you, and you choose to respond in a loving way towards them, that's not natural. You can't do that on your own. But he's going, God's Spirit wants to get you to the point where you're mature enough that you can love people that way, that you can love your enemy. Some of you, you're so amped up with the political stuff going on right now, and I said last week, the whole point of both political parties, it doesn't matter what party you choose, the whole point is for them to stir up the emotions so much that you show up and vote in the polls. That's always their agenda. And in the process of stirring up the emotion, you know how they do it? They always make the other side the enemy. Always. Now, this is just free advice, okay? But here's a little something about leadership. Anytime you see a leader, and he or she has to have an enemy to get a group of people to follow them, they're not much of a leader. Leaders don't have to push off the side of the pool to swim to the other side. They just swim. Leaders don't have to have an enemy to get people to rally around them. Their character and their integrity and their cause gets people to rally around them. So if you ever find a leader who has to have an enemy to get somebody to follow, you should be a little cautious about that person. But I'll tell you, if you're caught up in all of this, and you're like, oh, the people on the other side, whatever side you're on politically, the people on the other side, they are the enemy and they're destroying our country, and you just kind of buy into all the language. That acknowledging those people are your enemy is the worst thing as a Jesus follower you can do. And here's why. Because Jesus was very clear. When you have an enemy, he said, here's what you do if you follow me. You're to love your enemy, pray for them, and do good for them. You'd be better off not having enemies. It'd be a whole lot easier to live. I would just start saying everybody's my friend, Because when it's an enemy, it's super clear how you're supposed to treat them. This is the kind of love that Paul is talking about. The kind of love when that person on the other side you think is out to get you or going to harm you in some way, and you respond with love and goodness towards them. When you get there, then you're starting to get mature. He goes on. He says, what about joy? Joy is a mark of maturity, not joy when everything's going well. Again, anybody can do that. He says, no. Joy when things aren't going your way. Joy when you lose your way. Joy when you don't get your way. When everything you wanted to see happen doesn't happen and you find yourself having joy in the middle of it anyway, that's when you know as a Jesus follower, you're developing some maturity. Because that joy is not contingent on your circumstances or on everything happening just the way you want it to happen. Then he lists peace. Peace. Again, not peace when things are awesome. Peace when everything's unpeaceful. Now, if you're a Jesus follower, you got to understand this. The only way God teaches and develops these qualities in us is by putting us in the exact opposite situation. So there's nothing special about loving people who love you, being joyful when everything's going well, and having peace when the world's just right. But when you're in unpeaceful situations, when you're in uncertain situations, when you're in situations that scare you or make you anxious or worried, and you find peace in the middle of that, that's a sign of maturity. To be specific to what's currently going on in our country, if you get to November and the candidate that you don't want to win, the one that you think, oh, they'll just wreck our country if they're in charge, and they win, and you wake up the next morning and you have peace, now you've got a little maturity. But if you find yourself anxious and worried all the time, Paul would say, you're not there yet as a Jesus follower. That's just a sign of immaturity. And then as if these three things are not hard enough, Paul says, okay, well, how about patience? Can we just skip this one and move on? Because this one's tough, isn't it? Again, when you find yourself in situations that create impatience and you're being patient, there's a sign that God's been able to do some work in you. There's some maturity happening. To be more specific, when you find yourself interacting with people who are on the other side of you on some issue, they're on the other side of you politically. Somebody who's just wired in a way that, oh my gosh, it makes you so impatient and just drives you crazy. When you're having conversations with people and you're trying to convince them to see things your way and they just won't see things your way and it just frustrates you so much. No. When you've got some patience for those people in the middle of those situations, now you're maturing. Next, Paul says, kindness. Kindness towards people who are choosing not to be kind to you. Kindness towards people who are responding to you in a way that you don't appreciate. When you can respond to people with kindness, even when they hurt you, you're making some progress. But that's not natural, is it? And the reality is none of us can do that on our own. it's going to take some supernatural work in us to get us there. Next, Paul says, goodness. Goodness. This is what we ought to be known for as Jesus followers. We ought to be known for something good. We ought to be known for doing good. We ought to be known, again, for doing good to our enemies. This is what Jesus said. This was his clear instruction. So this isn't doing good to people who do good to us. That's easy. Anybody can do that. But are you doing good to the people who you know would not do good for you? Are you doing good when your natural inclination is to do something less than good? The next one he mentions is faithfulness. Faithfulness. In other words, Jesus followers ought to be a group of people who are known for always doing what they say they're going to do. And man, if I can't get it done, I'm not going to surprise you with it. I'm going to tell you as quickly as I can. Jesus followers ought to be the kind of people that folks who don't follow Jesus go, I'm so glad they're on my team. I'm so glad they're in my class. I'm so glad that I work with them. Because you can always count on those people. Man, you give them anything and you don't have to worry about it again. They're going to do it and they're going to do it to the best of their ability. They're so faithful. They keep all their promises. They have such integrity. That's what maturity looks like. What about this next one? Gentleness. This one's hard. Because what Paul is implying when he talks about gentleness is he's saying, do you look into the eyes of every person you meet and see someone who's made in the image of God, which means they are made with infinite value, dignity, and worth? And so do you act towards them, react towards them, speak to them in a way that's gentle, that reflects the value that they have? Not just the people like you, but the people who are on the other side of you. The people who see the world completely different. The people who are supporting things that you think that will wreck our country. I can't understand why anybody would support that. And you get in a conversation. Do you engage with them in a way that's gentle because of the value they have? Whenever I think of this, I think about my wife's china that she was given by her mother. I don't know if any of you guys have this, but she's got some china displayed, which is kind of pointless because we never use it. It's just a prop. That's all it is. But she has this china displayed, and whenever we have to move the china for something, man, it's like I'm handling it with kid gloves because it's quite possible she loves that china a little more than me. And I'm like, if I chip this, she's going to kill me because the value of that is just so high for her. This is the image. Not just with people who think like you and you're like, oh, they're so right and they're so smart because they line up with me on everything. No. When you're on social media posting something or interacting or commenting on something with somebody who sees things differently than you, when you're in a conversation at work or when you're at a ball game or wherever it is and something comes up and somebody's on the opposite side of an issue from you, how do you approach that? Mature Jesus followers approach it with extraordinary gentleness because that person that you dislike so much potentially matters just as much to God as you do. And so because they matter to God, they've got to matter to us the same way. And then finally, as if this wasn't hard enough, Paul says, and self-control. Who wants self-control? Can we just skip that one, But mature people always, you know this, mature people always have extraordinary discipline and self-control. Mature people always have a way of reining in those natural desires and doing the right thing, not the feel-good thing. So, if you were to ask Paul, all right, how do I know if I have a growing, mature relationship with Jesus? He'd say, well, here's your standard. It's this list right here. Just compare yourself, measure yourself against this. And wherever there's a gap, there's some immaturity. And wherever there's a gap, there's some room to grow. And if you're anything like me, when you do that, you find There's some maturing that still needs to happen. There's some maturing we still need to do. But Paul's point is the promise God gives us is He puts His Spirit inside of us to help us mature. He doesn't leave us on our own to do it if we'll just cooperate with Him. This is how Paul ends this part of his letter. He writes this. He says, so I say, I think it's going to come up, there it is, since we live by the Spirit, let us keep in step with the Spirit. In other words, since we have God's Spirit inside of us, how about we just pay attention and keep in step with the Spirit? So here's what I want to invite you to do. I want to invite you to think about that list Paul gave us and to pick one area where you think there's some maturing that needs to happen in you. Don't try to do a bunch at once. We're not that good. Just pick one. And I want to give you a prayer to pray this week to help you mature a little bit in that area. All you need to pray, you can do this every day. All you need to pray is say, okay, God, help me to pay attention and stay in step. Because I need to mature in the way I love people. I need to mature in my gentleness. I need to mature in my patience, whatever it is. So God, would you help me to pay attention to the moments where I'm about to do what comes natural and I'm about to be unloving. I'm about to be impatient. I'm about to be harsh. Would you help me to pay attention and notice those before I do them? And then God, would you help me stay in step with that, the voice, the nudge, the tap inside that your Spirit gives me that says, no, there's a better way to go. I want you to be gentle to them. I want you to be loving towards them. I want you to be kind in this situation. God, just help me pay attention to this one area and to stay in step. And when you get out of step, because you will, we all do, you just recognize it. You say, God, I'm sorry I got out of step. Help me get back in step because I want to do better next time. This is how maturing happens. This is what maturity looks like in Jesus followers. This is how you develop a we before me, you first kind of maturity. So if you were to ask me what's America need most now, I would make the case that what our country needs is a bunch of Jesus followers who decide to pursue that kind of maturity and become this kind of people. Jesus followers who decide that we're going to increasingly believe and behave more like Jesus. Unfortunately, and I don't have to convince you of this, unfortunately, if you ask people who are not in church in our country, hey, tell me the first thing that comes to mind when you think about Christians. That list Paul gave us, that standard, that's not what comes to mind, is it? It should be, but it's not. And the reason it doesn't is because the majority of Christians in our country today, we have chosen to settle for an all-about-me, customized, personalized version of Christianity. But it's burned bridges, and it's hurt people, and it's caused issues. It's created division. And we can't change it for our whole country. But you know what? We can change it for our little corner of the country. We could change it for our communities if we would commit to pursuing that kind of maturity. Now, last thing and I'll wrap up. If you're not a follower of Jesus, my guess is if we actually were the kind of people that Paul just described, you'd have a lot less problem with churches and Christians. And maybe this is brand new information for you because you assumed, if you follow Jesus, you have to be judgmental and hypocritical and on, because that's all you've ever seen. I get that. But if that list Paul described is who you want to be, it may be new information for you, but God wants to help you become that kind of person. The whole reason Jesus died and rose again was to offer you forgiveness and grace for when you fall short of the standard. And to give you His Spirit to help you become the kind of person you most want to be, the kind of person He created you to be, but the kind of person you can't be on your own any more than I can be on my own. And so if you're ready to take Him up on that offer, all you have to do is tell Him, Jesus, I'm ready to follow. I'd like your help. And I'm grateful for your forgiveness. But I want to pay attention and stay in step with your Spirit and see if you can help me develop that kind of maturity. That's what we should all be shooting for. Let me pray for us. Father, wherever we fall short in this, I guess my prayer would be that for those of us who are Jesus followers, we will not settle for a customized, personalized standard that just makes us feel good about who we are and what we do and how we treat people. But we'll look in the mirror and we'll own where we fall short of your standard of maturity. Help us pay attention to where there are gaps this week. Help us to stay in step with your Spirit, to pay attention, to listen to the little nudge that you give us to choose a better way. And would you begin to develop in us the kind of mature qualities and behaviors that only your Spirit can. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Hey, if you'd like more content like this, subscribe to our YouTube channel and download our Journey app to access all of our recent message content. And our app is the easiest way to share this content with a friend. For more information on our church or to find our app or our YouTube channel, just visit journeycalway.com. That's journeycalway.com. Thanks for listening.